Welcome everyone. I'm Blair Rubel and I'm director of the Comparative Urban Studies Project here at the Wilson Center. And I'd like to welcome you to the center on behalf of the Wilson Center President Lee Hamilton. And in particular, I would like to express our thanks to Senator Landrieu for finding the time to be with us this morning. The Wilson Center is the nation's official presidential memorial to the only American president to hold a PhD, Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. When Congress established the center in 1968, the founding legislation stated that its mission is to bring together the world of ideas and world of public affairs. I think this meeting very much represents the spirit of that mission, because the problems which are faced by America's energy coast require both public action and scientific research and thoughtfulness and engagement. The mission, the way the Wilson Center decided over time to fulfill this mission, some of my colleagues say we're like London, not like Paris. There never was a plan from above. It built up organically. Was to host scholars, and has been to host scholars, to engage in public outreach through publications, the Wilson Quarterly, TV, and radio shows, and to organize our activities around programs. And there are 24 programs here at the Wilson Center, of which the Comparative Urban Studies Project is just one. My colleagues at CUSP, as we call it, Allison Garland, Lauren Hertzer, and I are very pleased to be working with our colleagues from America's Wetland Foundation and America's Energy Coast. We've been working with them now for several years, and it has been, I have to say, inspiring for us to watch this process unfold. Inspiring because the challenges are so enormous, and the fact that anyone, anywhere is trying to deal with them seriously is inspiring. And inspiring because it's clear that there are pathways forward if we as a nation choose to follow them. So it's been a pleasure to work with Karen Gallagher, Lisa Noble, King Milling, Val Mamillion, and Sidney Coffey, and it's really great to be working with them again. I'm going to now turn the chair over to Mark Hurley, who's president of Shell Pipeline Company, and for this morning, what's perhaps more important, chair of the American Energy Coast Industry Group. And he will begin our conversation and our journey through a number of pressing issues. He's responsible for pipeline and terminal operations as well as road transport for Shell's business in North America, and pipeline business in North America, and he became the AEC Industrial Council Chair in 2007. And despite all those heavy-duty Gulf Coast responsibilities, he's actually a native of the Eastern Shore, so this is bringing him home to some extent. So, Mark.
Thank you. Yep, spent yesterday on the Eastern Shore. It's amazing how some of the challenges there are similar to some of the challenges we have in Louisiana, actually. But thank you very much for that. This is our second America's Energy Coast Policy Forum. As you heard, I serve as the chair of the America's Energy Coast Industry Council, and I'm also the co-chair of our steering committee along with my friend King Milling. And we're very happy and greatly excited about the progress that this group has made. We met here less than a year ago to start dealing with policy issues, and I'm very proud of all the people who have supported this effort and the progress that we have made, and it has been tremendous and very efficient. These are not easy issues to tackle. Shell believes that sustainability along the Gulf Coast has got to support energy production as well as protection of our communities and protection of the environment. And those are issues that come with a lot of tension. And so we feel the only way to really address these in a meaningful way is to get all the people in the room who are the stakeholders in the region, and we put the issues on the table and we have open debate. And it sometimes gets pretty colorful. Occasionally we have to call a timeout. but we get there. And the objective of our task forces is to come to closure on those issues where we find we have common ground. And it might surprise you to know that we have a lot of common ground. There are very few things that we put on the table that we can't find solutions to propose. And so we're very proud of the work that has been done here. This model allows us to work very closely with government, and that government connection is very important to us. Government support is absolutely required to deal with the issues that we face along the Gulf Coast. But this is not a government-led project. It's a project where the government's very involved, and we're very happy with that, and we foster it. It's a nonpartisan effort, so we kind of leave our politics at the door and deal with the issues that we face. And, sometimes that's difficult, but it is the urgency of the problems that we have along the Gulf Coast, and in particular the coastal erosion problem, that really forces us to transcend some of the differences that we have and find common solutions. It is noteworthy that we're here in Washington having this meeting. A lot of the discussion that you hear is about issues that we have along the coast, but this is not a regional issue. This is a national issue. The energy infrastructure for the nation resides along the Gulf Coast of the U.S., and what threatens that infrastructure threatens energy security for the U.S. And so, yes, it's very much a regional issue, but it's also, probably more importantly, a national issue. And I think that's a good lead-in to our next speaker, who is Senator Mary Landrieu. Senator Landrieu has been a great leader in this process as well, and we really appreciate your support, Senator, for the work that we're doing here. And so, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, and Mark, thank you for that introduction, and thank you mostly for your really extraordinary leadership in pulling such a prestigious group of industry leaders together and environmental leaders, and being so broad in your thought and your vision for what we need to do to get this great work done. And so I really appreciate it. And King, thank you for sticking with this. In King's earlier day, he used to be a banker. You all would not probably know that, because all he does is talk about coast and levees. You'd think he was in the engineering business or something, but he was, I guess, as a good background as a banker, because he kind of knows what a good investment is, and he knows that this is a good investment of his time to save a place that's quite special and probably lay a groundwork for a model that we can use, hopefully, around the world, if not only in our own country, but in many countries around the world. I want to recognize Tanner Johnson, who is my lead staff person on this, and really appreciate his leadership, and to say a good shout out to Val Mormillion and Sidney Coffey, who have been workers in the vineyard now for many years, leading this effort. Val grew up in Louisiana and thought he left us and went to California, but we've pulled him back, and now he's being from Houma, and his hometown is threatened. He figured he'd roll up his sleeves and get to work helping us save this coast. So as he hails from literally the center of the Louisiana Delta, we're thrilled for his leadership. And Blair, thank you for hosting this at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I got to speak with the Congressman, with Mr. Hamilton, for a short time before I came into the room, and I thank him for his leadership. And Lee reminded me that we have really an extraordinary group of scholars that come here to work on many, many important issues, and Congress is a real partner with the great work that this center does, and I'm proud to be one of the members that support it and will continue to support it, and look forward to the partnership that we can build with all of us that are working on these coastal issues with this great and very prestigious center. I'd like to begin my brief remarks this morning with a quote from Henry Ford, who said, "Coming together as a building is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is success." And we want to be successful, and the people that we represent collectively many people in the United States, and again, people around the world, are depending on us to be successful. So we have come together as a beginning. We've been keeping together all of these years, particularly in the last decade. We're making progress, but our working together is going to bring us success. And I would define that success, at least along the Gulf Coast, stretching from potentially Galveston to Mobile. The picture on the front dais shows the design of what we think of as the Gulf Coast. I would extend that up, if you could picture the river and the way the river has helped the Mississippi River to build this great coast. We also think of success in other places around our coast in the United States, but given this visual this morning, I would define it as a place that is safe and prosperous for people to live in, an environment that is healthy, and a place that is secure from natural disasters and threats primarily associated with water. We are in the Delta, one of the greatest deltas of the world, with subsidence, with rising sea levels. I was looking at the statistics the other day and came across the fact that 70% of all the hurricanes that have struck the United States have struck the Gulf Coast, basically this area between Mobile and Galveston. We're Hurricane Alley. So not only do we drain, 2/3 of the continent, we are strategically located for oil and gas and fisheries and navigation because we hug the mouth of this great river system and can't move because that's where the river is and that's where millions of people are going to try to live and work and prosper. And this delta that we call home is in great jeopardy. And we must figure out a way to bring the science together with the nonprofits and environmental community and the industry to figure out a way to sustain it and to build it, not just for the environment itself, for the marsh, for the wildlife, for the the general environment, but for the people who are an integral part of this and the culture that they represent. When we lose communities along the Gulf Coast, we don't just relocate people, we lose hundreds of years of history and culture. We lose the music, we lose the art, we lose the visuals of what that culture is, and it's worth fighting for. When I came to Congress 13 years ago, I decided that this would be my number one issue, or trying to mobilize not just the people in our state, but in our region, but in the country, to understand that we were a far distance in terms of being successful. 10 years ago, there was no dedicated stream of revenue in sight. There was a complete divergence of opinion and ideas about what this coast was. A, was it worth saving? B, who were you going to save it for? C, how would we work together as federal, state, and local agencies? Luckily, over the last 10 years, because of a lot of work done by people in this room, industry and environmental groups and members of Congress, delegations along the Gulf Coast, particularly from Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, we have identified at least a potential stream of revenue. It's real, it's substantial, and it comes in the way that many other states use their revenues, but for other purposes, or it comes in the same way, a percentage of oil and gas revenues that are generated within the boundaries of interior states. Many of you know Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico generate revenues within their states based on the production of oil and gas. 50% of those revenues come to the federal government, 50% stay with their states. So when I looked up a couple of years ago and said, how are we going to do this? How are we going to have the resources to build the kind of infrastructure necessary and learn, as the Netherlands teaches us in the 2 trips that I've been over there and a third that is underway in planning, to live with the water, not to barricade ourselves from it or to run away from it, but to learn to live with the water. How do we do that and sustain the kind of growth and prosperity we need? And we're talking not a few $1,000s, not a few $100 million, but billions of dollars necessary to do this. The only place that I could think is from the offshore oil and gas industry, which drilled the first well off of the coast of Louisiana, off of Creole, Louisiana, in the early part of this century. And that industry generates about $10 billion annually for the federal government. That money has come into the federal treasury and spent unrestricted on everything the federal government spends its money on, from education to health care to building parks and recreation. Lee, when you were in the Congress, and some of our colleagues before I got there decided that they thought that some of this money should be used for the expansion of national parks, which I agreed with, and established a trust fund, if you will, to use this money for the expansion of the national parks and state parks all over the country. I don't know if many of you caught the Ken Burns special on the history of the national parks. It was a magnificent reminder to us in the history of this, the treasure of these national parks, and such a unique American gift, the government to give to the people, or the people to give it to themselves. Very different. I don't know if I have the statistics clear, but one of our national parks, it may be Yellowstone, I believe might be bigger than the whole country of Switzerland. Did I hear that correctly? So, you know, the national parks of America, you know, is such a unique American experience and a model. Some of our colleagues thought that some of this money should go to establish those parks, both at the federal and at the state level. I couldn't agree more. I just added a piece that some of this money should go to protect our coastal estuaries and special places, of which I happen to represent, a place with 4.5 million people, Louisiana. So we passed, Congress has passed, to give to this group and to anyone that will help us, the Dominici-Landrieu Gulf of Mexico Energy Act, which the Gulf Coast senators joined with me in helping to pass in the last energy bill, which establishes for the first time 37.5% of these revenues, which is $3.7 billion a year. It's easy math. 37.5% of about $10 billion. That would be directed to saving this coast for all aspects of it, to make it more productive, to make it more prosperous, to help the navigation, to help the replanting of the cypress forest, the oak trees, the cheniers that used to be the natural protection, close some of the industrial canals that have been built and now are threatening, and to build the kind of water control structures or living with water structures that protect the people that live there. Having now lived through Katrina, Rita, Ike, and Gustav, which were 4 major storms, but nothing really like Katrina, which was more than a hurricane. It was a flood of biblical proportions. I can tell you that the people along the Gulf Coast are seriously threatened if we don't use this money and figure out not just the politics, but the science of how to keep people safe that have to live close to the water and close to these deltas, because they're the richest places on earth, the greatest agriculture. We need the navigation, we need the fisheries, we need the energy that comes from and around these coasts. Not only, though, is this a challenge for us, it's a challenge for the continent of Africa, it's a challenge for Europe, it's a challenge for Asia. 50% of the world's population live in deltas, created by rivers in low-lying areas. With the challenge now of climate change and the rise of sea level, the work that is before us is more important than ever. So I want to just say to you all, thank you for the work that you have done. Continue to think with us about how to move forward and to help us propose to this administration, to President Obama, a way forward. Now that we have identified the funding necessary, do we expand it nationally to include all the great coastal areas of America? Do we focus on the Gulf Coast as a model for other deltas in the world? How do we get the federal agencies that work in silos isolated from each other, whether it's the Corps of Engineers or the EPA, have conflicting jurisdiction over water issues and navigation and management? How do we get the federal agencies, and how do we integrate the science to help figure out in one of the richest, largest, and most developed. This is not a place that is an empty slate. This is a place that has all sorts of refineries and manufacturing and farms and communities. It's not a place that you can relocate the 10 million people that live in the Gulf Coast, basically, the southern part of Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, and just ask them to go live somewhere else. We have to create an environment where they're safe, they can prosper, our cities can grow, even larger footprints, potentially more dense, as opposed to spreading out, but how our cities can grow and our communities can grow by building the right kind of structures and supporting the environment in the appropriate way. So that is simply my message. I'm excited about the work that's being done. I thank the Wilson Center for being a part of it and for all of you. And if we can convince this administration to step out and take the lead on this major environmental effort underway. I know that Lisa Jackson, the administrator of the EPA, is from the 9th Ward in New Orleans. Her family was flooded out when the levees broke in Katrina. She knows firsthand the anguish and the pain and the suffering of families that are desperate for this coalition to come together and give them something that they can count on and, as King knows, invest in for the future. So thank you all very much. I'm happy to lead this effort. I'm thrilled to see our folks from Texas and Mississippi and Alabama here who are struggling to get that CAP money and get it moving in their states, just like we've done in Louisiana. But our revenues are dedicated. We are ready to go. Now we just need the plan of action and a spirit of cooperation and hard work to get us there. God bless you all. Thank you so much.
I would like to personally thank Senator Landrieu for joining us today and for her kind remarks. Needless to say, we are very happy to be here one more time in this marvelous spot. And Blair, we thank you very much for allowing us to venture back into these accommodations one more time. And I want to thank everyone here today for joining us. And I hope, quite frankly, that you will be enlightened and that this will be a productive meeting for all of us. For those new faces in the room, let me give you a little background on how we got this thing started. The America's Wetland Foundation developed the America's Energy Coast Initiative, AEC for short, to bring together the leaders of industry, the national environmental and conservation communities, academia, government, and diverse coastal interests throughout the energy-producing region that includes Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. One might think that that would be an impossible thing to do. But the fact of the matter is we all face a significant challenge that is much larger than any of the individual interests that we share. And as a result, what we have been able to discover is what we thought might happen was that there are common interests, there are common goals, and pragmatism in some large measure has set in and allowed these traditionally diverse interests to gather together and to begin to work towards solving a significant threat not just to the region but to the country. As a result of all of that, in the fall of 2007, if you've heard, the AEC initiative was launched to reach consensus on tough issues about the need for a working landscape, because we are in fact a working landscape. There is nothing necessarily pristine about the Gulf Coast. We want to sustain both energy and the environmental assets. We want to be able to sustain these remarkable, fragile navigational assets that are critical to all of us. And so as a result of it, we met in Houston. We argued, fought a little bit, but as a result of it, we issued an accord for a new sustainability. And out of that accord came the first round of priority actions, which we presented last December in Houston. At that same time, Dale Hall, who was at that time the director of the National Fish and Wildlife Energy Services and on our advisory committee, presented a report which we had long sought to obtain, which highlighted what we knew was one of the impediments to what we were trying to accomplish. And that document that he presented specified the examples of federal policy conflicts which effectively and negatively impact the implementation of critical projects across the region. It truly was a remarkable document, and I hope that it will stand as a forerunner of other similar documents from other agencies which traditionally have had siloed impacts, where we can begin to break down those silos and get these agencies to work together. It is critical for us, and I suspect it is critical for everyone else in this country that happens to be on the coast. During this past year, we have made strides on these issues and many others. We've held hearings in the region to gather testimony to inform our task forces as they develop policy resolutions. And we've grappled with many of the issues at our Leadership Council this past summer and came to an agreement on several significant resolutions addressing conflicting federal policies, proper utilization of harbor maintenance trust funds, and the risks of losing unique culture, assets, navigation routes across America's energy coast, and the impact of that loss upon the rest of the nation. Today we release a report, a region at risk, which highlights the vulnerabilities of the Gulf-producing states. We point out the vulnerabilities in context of the critical national assets being threatened in the context of the coastal decline. As the report clearly illustrates, these 4 state energy-producing areas can and should be the laboratory of sustainability as we address these challenges, not just for Louisiana, the Mississippi, and for the rest of the deltaic systems in this country, but quite frankly, the data and what we learn is transferable throughout the world. The diversity of interests served by our ecosystem and the enormity of their challenges all create inherent conflicts, but we find that we are above those conflicts and that we can, in fact, establish a new era of cooperation in the hopes of arriving at a fundamental balance that works to both sustain the environment, commercial assets that serve and protect the region and the nation, and I think that can be accomplished. Those of us who have been participant in this effort have primarily been the private sector. It is very important, particularly in this new administration, that we began to, as much as possible, incorporate the assets and capacities of the federal agencies that deal up and down this coastline. We've all got to begin to work in partnership and in sync to pull it together. We are at a standpoint of time where, clearly in connection with Louisiana, we are at the tipping point. And not maybe this year, but it is coming. And when it does, we have the potential of losing everything. We need to be able to obtain and manifest a sense of urgency, because at the end of the day, if we lose Louisiana, it does not stop at the borders of the Pearl River and our neighbors to the west. It continues. We can't allow that to happen. These conflicts are too great. The risks are too great, and quite frankly, the efforts being undertaken by this unbelievable, diverse group of individuals is the focal point, I think, of our being able to fix it and put it back together again. Val, let me ask you now to come up and run this show. Let me sit down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, King, and I would ask that our first panel come forward. What King mentioned was the release of the first report of the work, The Region at Risk, and I would call your attention to that in seeing how we follow our program today, which is basically a living version of this report. You've heard the front matter basically described as sort of the challenge, and we will now move into sections where we describe the actions that were taken by the America's Energy Coast process over the last year and a half. The first place that we start is with one of our neighbors in Mississippi. Tina Shumate will, with the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, will begin to describe the cultural impacts and a resolution from the America's Energy Coast on no net loss of culture. So, Tina, I will turn over to you, and you can stand or sit.
Okay, I think I'll just sit if that's okay. Good morning. My name is Tina Shumate. I'm with the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and also the director for the Mississippi Gulf Coast National Heritage Area. Just in case you don't know, there are actually 6 heritage areas in the Gulf region, 2 in Louisiana, 3 in Mississippi, and 1 in Mobile, Alabama. Well, actually, there's 2 more, 1 in Mobile and then 1 in Shoals, Mobile, Alabama. Anyway, I'm happy to be representing the America's Energy Coast Community Resiliency Task Force and glad to have the opportunity to present the No Net Loss of Culture resolution. This is usually done by Mayor Roach out of Lake Charles, but he is missed today. He could not make it, so I'm standing in for him. This resolution, which was originally released at the AEC Leadership Forum last July, was a result of testimony received in an AEC task force meeting on community resiliency held in the summer of Lake Charles. One of the key issues identified by AEC originally was that the vulnerability of our region's landscape not only threatens our homes, our businesses, and our infrastructure, but it also threatens our culture and the very fabric of our existence. We've lost languages already in the state of Louisiana. The histories of states that comprise America's Energy Coast paint a rich tapestry of cultural identity, varied languages, and religious heritages, distinctive architecture, and world-renowned cuisine, art, literature, and music. But the common thread that we share in our region is our unique cultures are at risk. In an effort to call attention to looming disaster, the AEC has passed the No Net Loss Culture Resolution. The resolution calls for recognition of all levels of government that cultures along this coastal region are at risk of being lost, and that commitments must be made to ensure that these policies and regulations developed to deal with the land loss and the threat of natural disasters incorporate the principle of the no net loss culture. The AEC resolution also calls for universities in the region to undertake research which will illuminate the impact of the loss of culture on communities, states, and the nation itself, and such findings identifying strategies that could be used to assure that as we deal with land loss and the threats of future natural disasters, that no net loss of culture and these reports be widely sent out. To that end, we have sent this resolution to cultural leaders at universities in the 4-state AEC region and asked to help to quantify that we be lost culturally as communities become more risk to weather events and land loss along the coast and more vulnerable to the possibilities of retreating from the Gulf. In addition, The AEC will work with individuals who are currently conducting research on this and other topics, and we plan to convene a meeting of these university researchers interested in sharing this information and discussing these paths in the spring of 2010. We hope you will all be involved in this effort. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Val.
Thank you, Tina. And what we'd like to have today feel like is a conversation. There are microphones on either side of the room, and we have folks that will help you get to it if you have questions. But one of the questions I guess I have is that, when we go through conferences or preparing legislation, it seems like the people get lost in the process. I mean, we have the welfare of estuary systems, we have the welfare of the commerce that moves through them, and then all of a sudden the people somehow get caught in the mix. And I would imagine part of the discussions is about that and the unique cultures of people.
Well, right now, anyone in the Gulf region, and possibly, probably countrywide, I would say, there's a problem in the fishing industry. As you know, the most recent, which probably shouldn't bring up, but I'll bring it up, Ron and I discussed whether to do it, is the oyster fallout in the Gulf region right now that FDA has come out with. It's not being well appreciated down on the coast. The fishermen themselves are saying that this will actually threaten this culture. So there you're losing actually an economic and a culture itself, and the people themselves will have to change what type of job they do. It hurts the economy, it hurts the environment itself.
And I guess we also have the case of Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, which is a small Native American community that basically is being told that they can't live there anymore and be protected. They can live there, but I'm not sure they can be protected. And that is a culture that is indigenous, I believe, to South Louisiana. So the issue is a real one, I would say, and how much priority can be given to it? Do you think that this resolution that calls for the universities to help us understand what the realm of the problem is will lead somewhere else?
Oh, I definitely think so. We actually are working in Mississippi with the Mississippi Gulf Coast National Heritage Area on an area that Katrina actually undug of a particular culture we completely lost. We didn't know there was a whole lot of Germans and Italians in our area. So you've lost that culture. The universities can bring in major, well, they've got the interest and a major component to bringing this back. Anytime you lose a culture, of course, you lose your landscape, and that can make a difference. Mm-hmm. So it changes the entire, what the state is about almost.
Okay. Any questions from the group? I will say that tomorrow in a discussion on World Delta Dialogues, that will be a project of 2010, the saving of cultures and indigenous peoples will be a part of that, as the cultural story, which is not as much told here, is in plain view, I think, when you look at some of these larger dispersing deltas around the world. Okay, yes.
Now, I just wanted to remind everyone that some of the NGOs that are working on this issue are working really hard with Native American communities and other communities on exploring how they can make plans and take advantage of non-structural flood control opportunities. And this is something, I think, from a policy standpoint, we need to be looking at what are those opportunities, are there obstacles to people using them. So this is something that our group, the national NGOs, are really looking into and wanting to make sure that we've got sort of maximum opportunity.
Right. And I would imagine maybe in the coming year there will be a report from the national NGOs on this relationship of okay, that's great, and we would love to welcome that and have it as part of our process. Thanks, Susan. Any other comments in terms of culture? Ted Falgu, for years, has represented the Port Fourchon area, one of the larger but maybe less known ports, but more significant ports along the Gulf Coast. And we've asked him to speak to another resolution about proper utilization of Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund.
Thank you, Val. Again, as he said, being on the coast in Port Fourchon, we often say we're doing coastal restoration before it became cool to do coastal restoration, because it's a matter of salvation when you exist in a high-energy environment. And this resolution originated from the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee of AEC, which I co-chair. So I thank for the opportunity to present it. We, as a committee, we sought to try to identify some low-hanging fruit that we could identify and perhaps show some progress very quickly, and very important some as well. So we, it's commonly known that we dredge a heck of a lot across this country. Specifically in Louisiana, nearly 80 million cubic yards a year, and only a small part of that is beneficially used to the maximum extent that it could be. And we said, well, how can we maybe work within the system to identify a way to maybe get an opportunity at increasing the utility of that spoil that's generated from port maintenance operations. And clearly for some time there has been an effort led by the American Associations of Port Authorities, by business and industry groups, to get this country to fully utilize its trust fund that it created back in 1986. Prior to 86, actually 100% of all dredging was paid for by the government. And in WERDA of 1986, they created a tax that where now industry paid for the maintenance of ports and harbors. And that tax generated is currently generating well over $1 billion a year, about $1.3 billion this year. And Congress is only allocating about half of that to maintenance dredging. The rest of it just sits in a trust fund. It can't be utilized for anything else except it actually masks the federal deficit. If that money is sitting and not being spent, you can show it as an offset, and it doesn't look like you're spending so much money perhaps in this country. And Congress has historically only allocated about half. There's about $4 billion now sitting in the trust fund. Congress allocated about $800 million, last year for maintenance. The Corps had identified the need of about $1.3 billion. So we have a large unmet need. Much of that material that they're dredging, as I said earlier, can't be used beneficially because there's not enough money into the Corps to do these projects. So one would think, golly, why don't we just fully utilize the trust fund? Well, that is an effort that others have pursued. We want to team up with them. We fully believe that if we would be spending, let's forget about the $4 billion that's sitting in the trust fund. Let's start just today utilizing what's generated, $1.3 billion. We could put a large part of that into the maintenance operations, have the money to use the material beneficially, to do the many things that Senator Landrieu and King have pointed out that we so dearly need along the Gulf Coast. So our resolution is very short and sweet in that we, of course, along the Gulf Coast, the threats to sustainability often take the form of damage or loss to critical infrastructure that is essential for safe, environmentally sound energy exploration and development for the movement of commerce in and out across the country through its transportation network. Nowhere is there more apparent than in the harbors and ports along America's coast. So therefore, be it resolved that America's energy coast supports that the tax revenues generated from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund be made available at the outset of each annual congressional budget cycle to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and be used for the original purpose intended by the creation of the fund, the operation and maintenance of ports and harbors. Be it further resolved that these funds support the beneficial use of dredged material to aid in environmental restoration, and be it further resolved that the assignment of necessary equipment be made to areas of most critical need and treated as priority by the Corps when fulfilling Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund mandates. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And if you haven't guessed already, this is a very policy wonky meeting we're going to be having here. And we're getting down into the weeds, into some stuff that's not so terribly sexy. But hidden in all of these problems is billions of dollars. We heard the senator talk about money. Now we've heard Ted talk about a different degree of money, and in some ways, more money. We're going to hear others talk about money. So hidden under all of the fixes that we're talking about in terms of conflicting federal policy is money that should be directed to the problems of the America's energy coast, but somehow it has found a way to go downstream somewhere else. So let's talk a little bit, Ted, about the equipment issue and how it is apportioned across the country. And as I understand it and appreciate it, you have the bulk of some of this work in Louisiana, but the equipment doesn't necessarily follow it.
Well, again, it depends on the equipment you use. There are many types of equipment that can do dredging, and when the Corps, in its own ownership, only has a small portion of the equipment in this country. Most of it is privately owned. But in their allocation of it, for instance, in the Mississippi River, where we have some of the greatest opportunities to beneficially dredge, the type of dredge that they are using will not allow for that kind of use. It'll be stored and has to be carried offshore and then dropped. You can't transport it by pipeline or some other method that would allow for a greater opportunity and beneficial use. So making those decisions, and a lot of that is because there's not enough money to do the dredging operation to call in for that kind of dredge. If you knew if you had $1.3 billion in your budget rather than $700 million, you could make those decisions early on, plan those kinds of operations, and get maximum benefit.
And this is, I mean, there is exactly a project that we would go after if there were the money. And what you're saying is the money is there, that would drive the equipment usage, and then we would have benefit usage of dredge material if things were working correctly. We're not even asking for anything to be changed, correct?
Right. I mean, industry, this is totally industry funded. Okay, all that money is being generated from the an ad valorem tax on cargo moving out of this country, into this country and domestically. And it's just not being used for the intended purpose that Congress authorized the trust fund to do.
Okay. Let's just take one more example of the shoaling and issues of shoaling on the river and projects that have ceased because the Corps does not have the funding to use that dredge and then keep the shoaling down in the river. This is something that we see directly happening in the Mississippi, correct?
It's estimated that we're only dredging about 30 to 40% of the areas that have been identified that need to be dredged annually in this country, and that's because of the budget.
Anybody have any comments or want to join in this conversation? Have anything to say on these two resolutions before we allow the next panel to come up? Thank you, Ted, Tina, appreciate it. They'll be around the room if you want to extend this conversation with them in any way. I'd like Sidney Coffey and Jerry Galloway to join the table if they would. As they're coming up, a prime focus and theme of this report, A Region at Risk, is really attacking the conflicting federal policies and regulations that make it very difficult for us to have coastal restoration along the entire Gulf Coast. And I will ask Sidney to begin this discussion by talking about these conflicting federal policies. I think Jerry Galloway from the University of Maryland, who has been a friend of America's Wetland Foundation and America's Energy Coast and helps us with our policy development, will give us some specific examples. So, Sidney, if we could begin with you.
Thank you, Val. And I'm not, first of all, I'm going to start off by saying that at the same meeting in this summer at which these other resolutions were passed, we also passed probably the what we considered a very important resolution, which was dealing with conflicting federal policies and the need to resolve those conflicts. It's a lengthy one, and so I'm not going to read it all, but it is definitely available in packets out front. This group, first of all, I want to say we deal with a variety of issues through our individual task forces. Some of that has been touched on today, some of the issues that we deal with. But they are on ecosystem restoration, energy production and security, infrastructure and navigation, climate stewardship, conflicting policies, and community resilience. All of them are very important. All of them come with their own individual sets of issues and constituents who feel very passionately about them. But we as a group, everyone who sits around the AEC table agreed that, as important as each individual issue that we're dealing with is, we simply cannot make real progress without doing the thing that is sort of overarching everything, and that is resolving these conflicts in federal policies. As we look at these things, I have to say that just in my own background, I worked with both Governor Foster and Governor Blanco of Louisiana on coastal issues for about 12 years, and this whole issue of conflicts kept coming up over and over and over again. It's just, it didn't matter if you had all the money in the world you needed, which I can assure you we do not. But even if you did, you just can't get from point A to point B with the conflicts that are existing right now, and they're all very meaningful. I mean, you have all these federal agencies with individual missions, all very well intended, all very well thought out. But then what happens is they become mired into their silos through certain acts like QIPRA and others. I think there is a genuine feeling by these agencies that they truly do integrate their resources, that they truly do coordinate. But somehow that doesn't get down to the cubicle level. The people who are actually on the ground doing the work come up all the time with their own individual siloed mission, and how that does just simply not relate to the silo right next to them working on the very same project. This is not just an issue that is extremely difficult for states like Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi and Alabama, but all the great ecosystem restoration efforts around the country are affected by this. And I know in my days with the state, we saw that every day. This was not just a problem we were experiencing. All these systems had the same issues at heart and that were impeding their progress. And then when it comes to America's Energy Coast, you have this extra layer that comes into play, and that's the uniqueness of this coast, which has also been touched on today. The fact that the nation depends completely on the energy and navigation and other economic and fisheries and all the economic activities that happen on this coastline, that the nation absolutely depends on them, brings in a whole other complicated layer. And so what we have to deal with is entirely different in many respects than what the rest of America's coastline deals with. So when you start piling on all of these different things, you really have some issues that stop us through economic development, stop coastal restoration, stop protection, hinder the integration of all of this, which is critical. We have to have it. We have to be able to integrate these policies, and right now they're simply not at the federal level. The core process, of course, is a great deal at the heart of the matter. It's a slow, cumbersome process, exacerbated by, legalities. A broken process. I think I'm not out of bounds to say that by any means. The Corps' mission is navigation, basically, and flood control, not ecosystem restoration, and it shows when we're trying to get from here to there. When it comes to a highly vulnerable region like the Gulf Coast, and you further focus in on Louisiana's coastline, which is being lost at the fastest rate, literally, on the planet, and you top it with climate change impacts like sea level rise and strong storms, it makes for a terribly, terribly urgent situation that must be given national commitment, starting with the reconciliation of these policies. And I know that Jerry Galloway is going to get more into some of the detail of this, but later on in this program we will too, through a closer examination of the Coastal Impact Assistance process and NEPA and how that's implemented. But I want to say it all kind of comes down to just a couple of really important things, and it's about authorities and how those authorities are carried through. It's about interpretation of policies and missions. And it's basically, and Jerry, I'm hoping that you're going to get into this more, it's about an inability at almost every level to make decisions, which just sort of everything comes to a screeching halt. Who makes the decisions?
And Sydney, I just want to mention, because I think two things. One, this is being streamed live on the web, so that we have people from around the country and the world actually that we've notified that can follow this at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which we appreciate. And we have just seen an ad when the interagency task force came to New Orleans with CEQ from NGOs and a number of interests, I think, that King had signed. But it seems like there's not disagreement on this conflicting federal policies issue.
Oh, yeah. He's referring to the Oceans Policy Task Force that came and held a hearing in New Orleans, which they're doing all around the coastal areas. And it was just resounding. I mean, from everyone, this recurring theme of there's a problem, there's a real problem. These laws are in conflict. You know, we can't make considerable movement forward unless we start looking at how we break down these silos and work together. And it was coming from everyone. I mean, I heard it from fisheries representatives. I heard it from not federal, but I heard it from state agencies, from environmentalists, from industry. Everyone is saying the same thing. And what ends up happening then is you've got things that you think it's all being coordinated nicely at the federal level, but when it gets down on the ground, the states just can't make it happen. And then it's again an issue of who gets to make the decisions and why aren't those decisions happening.
Well, we're going to turn it over to Jerry, whose resume is longer than the time we have for this meeting on these issues. But we appreciate you being with us and always helping us move through and understand these issues, Jerry.
Thank you, Val. I would comment that even though I'm at the University of Maryland, I was born on the Gulf Coast in Mobile. I've lived in Mississippi, and I've been on the Mississippi River Commission worried about the river. And there's an interesting part to start with, Sydney. We have an oceans policy task force that's looking at issues there, but their policies and their issues may be in conflict with those that worry about the Mississippi River and the entire drainage basin. So it is a challenge. It's very difficult as we deal with this challenge of inconsistent and conflicting federal policies that need to be resolved to recognize that the first level is we've got to identify what the conflict is and identify it clearly so we can address particular issues. All too often we are in a broad idea that there's no activity there. There's a lot of activity, but we're not bringing it together. It starts with the fact that about 26 years ago, we abolished coordination at the federal level. That's amazing that we've talked about these stovepipes, and for 26 years, we've not had a organization in the federal government above the individual agencies that coordinates the activities of these agencies. So issues are hard to resolve, and it's only recently with the task force that have been formed in CEQ to deal with this that we're beginning to see some effort to bring people back together. There are also problems is how do we get people to come together and deal with these issues? And having been at the Washington level for a long while, we tend to think of the federal government as a monolith, but there's the Congress, which does its thing, and there's two sides to the Congress, which creates other problems. There are the agencies themselves who have individual rules, and frequently the agencies must operate under the administration. They always must operate under the administration, but the agency view and the administration view in terms of the departments may be in conflict, and then we have the White House, OMB and CEQ. a lot of players in this game, and one of the challenges in identifying and dealing with conflicts is to find out who's got the ball. And it may be that everybody thinks they have it or everybody thinks somebody else has it. And in reality, those things fall through the cracks. There's some interesting examples of this. They come out in the report that was mentioned earlier by Dale Hall and Fish and Wildlife Service and other reports by the National Academy. Take the case of this induced shoaling that comes about when you try and create a diversion on the river. It creates shoals in the navigation channel, and the Corps of Engineers says, well, that's a local sponsor responsibility. You want to make a difference in this levee. You want to cut through it and divert water, and it's going to cause this problem. You've got to pay for that. But the reason you have to do that is because the restoration is taking place because the levees that you want to cut through caused the delta to disappear or cause it to be degraded. What authority is there? The Corps has authorities to deal with restoration. The Corps has authorities for navigation. How do you bring those two together, especially within the organizations? There are individual stovepipes dealing with that. That's a challenge, and that's one that continues. You've heard it in terms of the funds, but it's also in terms of the interpretation of the policy. Another one is the benefits that come from moving dredge material to a location where it could be beneficial, not at the large scale, but even on small projects. The Corps looks at the least cost alternative. They look at the least cost alternative because, quote, that makes good sense. And if you want to change it from the least cost, just dump it over the side or take it out and drop it, get a more expensive dredge or put it here, pump it some distance, all of those more expensive costs are looked on as local costs. But again, why are they doing it? They're doing it to restore the wetlands, which is another project, another authorization of the Corps. How do you bring those together? Well, it turns out that one of the issues, and it's a very big one, and it's another issue that's raised in this document, is something called principles and guidelines. For many years, the Corps of Engineers and other federal agencies have operated under a document that says, here are the rules for federal water resource development, and they start off by the federal objective being national economic development, with really no consideration of environmental activity and also public safety. The Congress recognized this, I'd say finally, in 2007 WRDA, where they directed the Corps of Engineers for their projects to go in and change the principles and guidelines to recognize the necessity for, yes, economic efficiency, but also for environmental projects, the need to restore areas that have been degraded, and also to protect public safety. The Corps prepared their document to change this, which in the case of dredge material and the beneficial use would allow a project to be blessed because it not only had some economic benefits, but the least cost, when you look at it, may be when you include the environmental benefits of placing the material properly. The Corps sent their document forward. It went to the administration that looked at it, and the administration decided, I personally think quite wisely, that this document ought to apply to all federal agencies, not just the Corps of Engineers, and that we ought to take an approach that will allow us to take into consideration these environmental benefits, just what we're doing in restoration. That document is scheduled to be released in the next 60 days by the administration for comment. I will tell you the challenge that you face is, yes, we're going to get a new document, but how long will it take for that to, A, get out into the public, be passed by the work that's going on in the administration and be issued by the administration, and then to get the word, as Sydney has said, down to the person on the ground that has to do that, the person that's preparing the plan. But we are starting to address these if they continue to move. But things like this are very slow. It's 2007 November when Congress said to do this. It's 2009 November, and we're still not anywhere close to having that. Another one is obstacles in permitting. Just an example, permits are required for any number of things. Under Section 404, again, a Corps program, but it's a Corps program and an EPA program, and it's a water quality in the state program. And this has occurred not only in the Gulf Coast, it's occurred on the western Pacific coast, it's occurred other places in the country. We have a desirable objective. There's a lot of study that's gone into it. You come in for a 404 permit, and everything still has to go through all of the steps. There's no expedited process when there is a very fundamental difference between these sorts of projects and other projects that were intended to be covered under 404. That's a policy issue, and it's one that can be worked out between EPA and the Corps again with the assent of the Congress, because the Congress has to understand what's going on as they issue these permits. A third thing that is very important is funding stops and starts. It is very difficult to move programs ahead when you don't know how much money you're going to get, and when you get it, you don't know how long it's going to last. There have been numerous studies that have been done here in Washington that point out that if you give somebody a one-year contract and then have to go for a second-year contract or a third-year contract, it's not only terribly inefficient, it's also costly to the government. You don't get good programs. There's got to be a way to eliminate this, to have the Congress deal with this issue of multiple-year funding, and the administration actively support this process. The last thing I just comment that's mentioned in the report, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Study. That was authorized by the Congress. Senator Landrieu was very much involved in getting that, said, where are we going to go? And when the study is yet to be turned in, it's a 2-year study that's now probably approaching 5 or 4 years, and we don't have it out. But it is, as the complaint in the report says, it is not comprehensive. It hasn't thought through how this fits into everything we're doing. People, and we believe the agencies, have to come together and decide on comprehensive approaches to comprehensive problems, and that's a tough one for us. If I could conclude by saying, I think there's 3 things that we can do collectively here in Washington. One is communicate, stay in touch with what's going on, identify the problems. It doesn't do much good to talk about a generalized problem. You need license plates. You need the specifics of what the particular issue is, because if you can resolve one issue and set a precedent with this, then the others will fall into place. But I can tell you, having been a federal bureaucrat and having been part of the process, if you see somebody else struggling or not moving ahead, you're going to probably not venture forward. But if you see clear action, you will see things happen all over the country. The second thing is we've got to come together. We've got to have cooperation. So we've got to communicate with each other. Then we've got to agree to cooperate and break down these stovepipes. There's a need for this coordination body, the third element. We need to bring people together. If we could just take the 5 biggest issues that face coastal Louisiana and bring together representatives of the Congress, representatives of the administration and the agencies, and sit down and decide what needs to be done and then do it, and pin the rose on somebody to do it. One of the problems that a complaint that comes up with this conflict is, yes, I talk to one person and they say, oh, yes, we agree with you. You talk to an agency head and yes, we agree with you. But getting it from the person on the ground that has to get it done through that process is so difficult that by the time it gets out of the pigeonhole or the box in the office of counsel, it has disappeared as a problem. We've gone on to something else. So there's a need to come up with an expedited decision process to identify the conflicts, bring people together to discuss them, and then decide who's got the ball to run with on this and see that they go through. Because if we can set the example with processes that move things forward, that will spread rapidly to other agencies. But it's got to start with a team effort, and we believe that's the best way to move ahead with these inconsistent and conflicting programs.
There seems to be a culture against dealing with issues comprehensively. I mean, it probably goes back to the way Congress is designed. Is it going to require legislation to deal holistically, comprehensively across systems?
Well, that's certainly come up. The issue, the House held hearings on watershed planning, and that was one of the issues. How do you reconcile programs in one side of the House, the Congress, that focuses on individual projects, and the other one wants to go for a comprehensive approach? I think it does take the Congress to sit down and agree. Senator Landrieu has pointed out the problems when you're dealing with this sort of a situation. We've got a large area, a watershed to deal with, multiple watersheds to deal with, and we need to treat them together, and I think we need the assistance of the Congress to make that happen.
And I want to ask this too, and hopefully toward the end of this, we'll get to some of these questions from to people who can answer us representing Congress. But how willing is Congress to? I mean, since they've got each of these committees and subcommittees have certain jurisdictions over those agencies. How willing are they to sort of relinquish authority over these agencies or combine authority and look at that? I mean, that's a real that would be a big sea change.
Most certainly, and I think that's the issue. We know of the conflicting authorities. Right now there is a restudy underway in the Missouri Basin to reconcile all the conflicting authorities and come up with a proposal for what's needed. Now, that's from outside the Congress. Now, the question is, will the Congress resolve that? In 2002, the Congress was given a report by the National Academy that said the Missouri is in trouble because you have all these conflicting laws. It just did not fall to any one committee to pick that up and run with it. And so we need the assistance, and I see Tanner there, the assistance of the Congress to really move ahead and help. We have to identify what these conflicts are with the agencies and then present them with some alternatives.
We go, I'm just going to ask President King, we go system to system. We go to the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake, we go over to the West Coast, a couple of programs there. There is no water agency. There is no way to have a priority. How do all of these issues get dealt with?
Well, that's the issue. We used to have a Water Resources Council. It grew too big for its britches and was abolished because it was trying to do too many things. I think that what we'd like to see, and you've already mentioned it, is that we want somebody that'll bring the agencies together to say, okay, this is the challenge. We're getting complaints, and it's an important one. You all sit down and give us your recommendations, and we, the administration, the Water Resource Council, through the president, will take it to the Congress. And the Congress is very cooperative. I know from the hearings they've held that they want to move ahead with these sorts of things, but I don't think we've given them a blueprint.
Okay, King.
I was thinking about your comments concerning the Missouri River. It well could be that we could fix the Missouri and mess up the Mississippi. I mean, it's not a, it's a very conflicting issue from that standpoint. Also, it appears to me that while I absolutely adhere to the concept of a comprehensive plan, it is also clear that there are parts of the country, and we can take South Louisiana and Texas, etc., our problems are not necessarily the same problems that are being faced in other parts of the country, and yet they're the same regulations that apply across the board. So comprehensively, we've applied these massive group of laws that intend to reach every kind of environmental issue, and in fact, though, there are idiosyncratic issues within that cause significant conflicts as well. How do we get around that as we move forward?
Well, I think this meeting today is a great start because we're identifying what the issues are. We've gotten several reports that speak to them. We have a government that, by its very nature, a man named Lindblom from Yale many years ago wrote a paper on muddling through. And that's what we've been able to do. We've muddled through incremental changes and never step back and do what Sidney mentioned, bringing these ideas together and dealing with it. If there's something that needs to be done, we need to identify it specifically and then drill in and do it quickly.
Tanner.
Dr. Galloway, since we have you here, I may be on the spot later, but I want to put since we have you, your experience on the spot, so to speak. We have a body that you served on, you mentioned when you started, that exists for some element of this purpose, which is to manage the river. Mississippi River Commission is one of the oldest presidential commissions in the country. You served on it. And I get this question frequently when we talk about the way forward, we talk about new or better ways to manage the Gulf Coast and coastal Louisiana. What prevents the Mississippi River Commission? What obstacles do you see as it exists today, and looking briefly at its history, from being an effective voice in better management of the river with the additional purposes of ecosystem restoration? I mean, most of the competing policies we talk about are going to lie within that sort of gray area between the purposes of utilizing the river better for ecosystem restoration while preserving navigation. Where does the Commission have a place in this, if they do at all?
Well, I certainly believe the Commission can't do it alone. If the Commission had the full authority, and it was just as we saw with the hurricane protection system for New Orleans, it was not part of the work of the Mississippi River Commission. It was a separately identified project, had no real sponsor other than the law that eked it out a little bit at a time. if the commission were given responsibility for coastal Louisiana and you integrate it, and you really have to, how can you say you can separate the Mississippi River from the Gulf Coast? They go hand in glove. But in saying that, the commission also has to operate in close cooperation then with the states, with some sort of advisory support from them. There are civilian members of the commission that represent the states. That's certainly a part. And there are methods available to get that information and give the state a very strong voice in dealing with this. But clearly, if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, since 1993, the commission has assumed its full responsibility from St. Paul, Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, and is working more closely at the two other military commission members of the Ohio River General and the Missouri River General. So that you've got in that group all the people that control the Corps' activities. It's a move forward. They're working for the plan for the future, a long-range plan. It's got to include the coast, and the coast has got to include the Mississippi. So how you build that and how you ensure the representation, I've said publicly that the Department of Interior ought to have somebody on that commission because it's a very critical part of this. But I believe and support what the commission has done since 1879. It has been the one body that has gone up and down the river and every 6 months is out there talking to the people and has a fairly good relationship with the states from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico.
But actually connecting the river to the coast, which is basically what we need, there is a gap.
Yes.
There's a tremendous gap.
It just flows right by us.
It does.
Right.
It just goes straight out.
Another issue here is the storms come and go, and we know they're in our past and in our future. And when they come, there's all these cooperative task forces that get put together, and everyone thinks that the problem is solved because so much intensity is around those storms. But when they leave, we still have the problem. So how do we work through those kind of situations in a vulnerable ecosystem or Gulf Coast like we have?
Well, certainly the federal government, 4 federal agencies, USGS, NOAA, the Corps of Engineers, and the Bureau of Reclamation, put together a recent report on climate change adaptation. Let's not argue whether it's climate change or global warming or why, but their report said, look, something's happening. We've had Katrina. We've had other hurricanes. We've got to deal with it. So let's collectively start planning now rather than waiting for the next disaster. And so that's the answer. You've got the momentum. I'm amazed, to be honest with you, if you look at the history of previous floods, that now, 4 years afterwards, we're still talking about it and still working on it. There are people that care about it, and I give a great deal of credit to the congressional delegations from the coast, because in most other cases, 2 or 3 years after the Missouri floods, we had Iowa floods in 2008, and people have gone back to doing things as normal. We can't let things go back to normal.
One of the things that's in this report, the risk report that's released, is the uniqueness of this particular region, and not the unique ecosystem alone, but the unique working region. It seems that we have so many conflicts, and the report points out that while we have conventional energy being developed, we have a movement in the country to reduce carbons, and that might conflict, so we get discounted in the region. We have these huge storms, and we have coastal erosion that's ongoing. How do you get a region to be seen as unique for its assets without having the difficulties, because of our reputation, in convincing people that we've got all these problems in one place?
Well, I certainly believe that what the AEC is doing is the first step. There's a tremendous education problem. You can stop anybody on the metro this afternoon, ask them about Louisiana, and they know very little about it. They don't recognize all it means in terms of fisheries, culture, the energy. It is an important factor. We are doing a much better job of getting that word out, but it's a long way from here, and we need the support of the administration and the Congress to recognize that. And I think we're sort of headed in that direction. I've seen recently a change and a feeling that people are listening to you.
Mm-hmm. And Sidney, if you take this resolution, we're going to give it to everybody today. What does success with it look like?
Well, success, I would think, would be to see some rather immediate understanding, at least by the present administration, and ability to begin to administratively change some things. I would also love to see coming out of this some hearings here on Capitol Hill, which would help help some of these committees and subcommittees better understand what we're dealing with and why these issues in these conflicting jurisdictions really affect what's going on. And I would just like to see, a better understanding, maybe with help from everyone, all the folks who are at our table, industry, NGOs, all of us, coming together and educating not only our own constituencies, but the people of our country about what happens and why. Because, some of it, Val, I think it seems that the Gulf Coast as a region is sort of tainted in the eyes of the rest of the country. Oh, they produce energy down there. It's not a pretty white, pristine, lovely place oftentimes. But I think then there becomes this incredible disconnection for people in the rest of the country to understand what that coast really does and why it's there, and to truly understand that when a storm comes and hits that coast, that you really can't find gasoline in Atlanta. I mean, there's a reason for that. There's a reason that what happens out there has to have a sound environmental platform from which to operate. And the communities who service that industry and who service the fisheries for this country and all the things that go on this coast, there's a reason they have to be protected. It's not just for them and their individual cultures. It's really for the benefit of the entire nation. And I think it's lost.
I'll put an exclamation mark on that, and you and I have had this conversation. I went to one of these World Conservation Atlases, and there are flags all over the world on it, but there is no flag in South Louisiana or Mississippi. And we do feel that there are these huge conservation issues at play, and there's none in Texas. And so it is seemingly through a lens that we can't see our own problems that are very close to us, and it seems that fixing some of these problems might be to get the flags out there on the globe.
Could I just comment that, though, the wonderful thing that I've seen with the work at the AEC is bringing together the diverse elements who populate the coast. The environmental groups see this as a benefit, that we can show that green infrastructure, we can protect people from floods by having better wetlands. We can restore the ecosystem by having better wetlands. It's a win-win situation. And there's give and take, and I've been impressed with the way the national environmental groups have jumped in on this and worked together with the energy industry and everybody else in trying to come up with the right solution.
Well, thanks. We are going to talk about NEPA when we come up and the effective implementation of NEPA. We're going to talk about CAP and what is considered probably not the effective implementation of CAP. And then we're also going to have a word from Capitol Hill, from both the House and the Senate. They're going to talk to us about how they view the problems that we're raising in the context of congressional policy. So 15 minutes and we'll see you back.